So today we're going to talk about public commenting on regulatory actions. So what are regulations, or as they're often called, rules? These are legally binding provisions that the executive branch sets for systems it is required or empowered to implement by congressional action. So Congress passes a law, and then the executive branch issues regulations or a rule that provide more detail about how that law will be implemented. So for example, there are rules about procedures at immigration court or standards for adjudicating certain immigration statuses, and those are executive branch actions that provide detail about how the executive branch will implement legislation on immigration, which Congress has passed. Regulations differ from executive policy announcements or policy changes, which can be more easily changed and have a more limited impact. The Administrative Procedures Act is a congressional action that provides specific detail about what procedures the executive branch must follow in order to make changes or new regulations. Within the APA, one such procedure is called notice and comment rulemaking, and this requires the executive to follow certain procedures before issuing new rules. This includes publishing a notice of the new rule, allowing a certain period of time for the public to comment or to provide input, and then for the executive branch to review and consider all of the unique comments it receives before it issues a final rule, which then has effect and becomes difficult to change without issuing a new rule, changing the old rule. There are different kinds of regulations or rules. So one is called a notice of proposed rulemaking. This does not take effect immediately after the comment period has closed. It takes until the executive issues a final rule. So one is called notice of proposed rulemaking. So this is simply a notice, it's not actually a rule or a regulation, of the new rule that the government intends to create. It doesn't have an effect until after a comment period has opened and closed, which allows people to comment on the rule. It's usually 30 days to 60 days. And for the executive has to then consider all of the comments it receives before it can issue a final rule. And that can take months or even years. There's also something called an interim final rule. And this is essentially a notice of proposed rulemaking that has immediate effect or that has effect after a certain period for comments, but before all of the comments are considered by the administration. It eventually does get finalized or should eventually get finalized, but also has immediate impact while it's waiting for a final rule from the administration. We are seeing a lot more of these since 2025. There are also final rules, and these usually have no additional comment period and take effect once the rule is published or based on an implementation period, which would be announced in the final rule. These should reflect consideration of all of the comments that were received from the notice of proposed rulemaking or during the comment period of an interim final rule, and explanations of why the executive is either incorporating or not incorporating the changes or concerns that were raised in those comments. So what is commenting and why is it important? Commenting is submitting, either as an individual or an organization, a comment of any length that details why you support or oppose a regulation. Submitting comments raises issues that are important for the executive to consider before it finalizes a rule that will have an impact on people or the country. Comments can provide alternatives for the executive to consider, so, an alternative way that it could do something or changes that it could make to the proposed regulation. Comments can also create a record that assists in litigation or future regulatory changes or future congressional action. So by issuing comments, we're generating a record, a public record that raises issues or, raises areas of support that explains why this regulatory change is good or bad. And courts or future administrations or Congress that are looking at this issue can look to that record and find those comments helpful in determining exactly how the policy should be changed. Comments can also slow down the process of rulemaking by providing relevant information for the executive to consider. And because the executive is supposed to consider all comments before it finalizes a final rule, having more comments to consider obviously takes more time. Comments also ensure that people are actively participating in U.S. policy development. So this is yet another way that we can get involved, such as, calling Congress. This is essentially calling the administration. So how do you comment? Commenting is really easy because there's no specific format to follow. So you need to follow a few basics that the administration lays out. But other than that, this is a really great opportunity. You don't need to be an expert in order to comment. So you'll find the relevant regulation on regulations.gov by either searching the title of the regulation or the topic or a reference number if you have one. Once you get to that page of the regulation, then there will be a button that you can click that says comment. So you click on that and it takes you to a form page that you will need to fill out. It asks for whether you're commenting as a organization, an individual, or anonymously. Organizations are things like businesses or nonprofit organizations. Individuals are obviously individual people, and then you can comment anonymously. A note about anonymous comments is that the anonymity relates to what is published on the government website. It does not necessarily relate to the data that is collected about you. So consider this if you have concerns about that in relation to commenting, and perhaps you can comment with an organization or in some other way. In these or on this form, you'll then be asked to provide your comment. It provides a text box where you can copy and paste the full comment or just a summary. And then you can also submit an attachment, and then you can do some kind of mix of both of those. This is what the Advocates does, where we provide a summary in the text box and then a full attachment of our comment. There is no specific format for comments, unlike briefs to the court. So some people submit comments that are drafted as letters, while others submit comments that look a lot like a brief to the court. There's no specific page number. There's no requirement to paginate your pages. There's no specific format for a title. You should make sure that you provide the correct reference number on your comments. So that can be found on the regulations page that has the regulation and the opportunity to comment. It's usually some mix of characters, like an abbreviation for the agency that's doing the regulation, and then some mix of numbers that relates generally to the year it's issued and some reference. And make sure that you submit your comment no later than 11:59 Eastern Time on the day that is listed as the deadline. Earlier is also fine. So what makes a good comment? Good comments detail the impact of the regulation, whether it's a good impact or a bad impact, or some combination thereof. You can provide examples, which can be really helpful. So this could be something like if you're an attorney, you might know that a regulation will impact your clients in a certain positive or negative way. Make sure that you're not including personally identifiable information in any of those examples, but this can be a good way to raise an issue and give specifics. It can also detail areas of the current system on which you or others rely and how the change would impact those. This could include things like financial impacts, personal impacts, or legal losses. You can also rebut or support statements made in the rulemaking. So when there's a notice of proposed rulemaking or an IFR, generally the department explains why it's changing the rule or issuing a new rule, and it provides some kind of basis for that change. If you know that the basis is false, you can raise that. If you know that the basis is true, you should add your experience or information that supports that. Generally, rules also talk a bit about the cost of the change. And so if you have information about costs that weren't considered or costs that you think were miscalculated, you can include this in your comment. And you can also raise any relevant legal standards or case law, but that is not required. You can also speak from your personal experience if it's relevant. Again, comments aren't necessarily anonymous, so make sure that you're not providing identifiable information if you're not ready for that to be available. And so an easy way that the Advocates has tried to make it accessible for people to comment is that we will post updates on commenting opportunities on our Take Action page. There's really no timeline for comments, so the administration can issue, 3 regulations that are open for comments at one time, or once per month, or once per year. They aren't required to have these happen at any specific time, and there's not a really good calendar to see when these will be coming out. So keep an eye on our Take Action page or our social media to see opportunities to comment that are really related to the work that we do at the Advocates. And on those pages, we will post some basic information about the regulation, the reason that the Advocates is excited about the change or concerned about it, some suggestions about what others might include in their comments, a template comment if we have one available, and then a link to the regulatory page so that you can submit that comment. If you have questions, you can also contact our office, and we think this is a really great opportunity for people to get involved, and it can make a really big difference in what our policy and regulations look like in the United States. So we have a regulation open now, and you can find it on our Take Action page.